Is chronic inflammatory response syndrome the most understudied disease ever? Let's find out. On this Science Spotlight number 5, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. It's a story of environmental toxins, water-damaged homes, and the Shoemaker protocol. Let's dig in. To introduce this topic, let's explore what CIRS is. So CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. What is it? Well, it's an immune response to fungal and bacterial toxins, predominantly from places like water-damaged homes. It's heavily related to, though not perfectly identical with, sick building syndrome. And there are some related terms that it isn't. There's another acronym, CIRS, with an S, that is not CIRS with a C. CIRS with an S, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, is an exaggerated defense response of the body to a noxious stressor, so it's acute. Usually comes from infection, trauma, surgery, etc. CIRS with infectious source is typically called sepsis, whereas chronic inflammatory response syndrome is longer term. It's not as immediate, but you can see how it has similar effects without being the same thing. However, there is another malignancy that might actually be CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome, which is sort of has an unknown etiology, a lot of the same symptoms, so it might be a mixed diagnosis in some, if not, though probably not all cases. And importantly, CIRS is not unworkable. It actually can be cured, primarily by removing the exposure, to the fungal bacterial toxins, and then a series of treatments. Now, a great review going over chronic inflammatory response syndrome, especially with the clinical efficacy of treatment, a review came out from the Annals of Medicine and Surgery in 2024, which goes over a great overview of CIRS. So some more details in the highlights. It's a multi-symptom illness acquired following respiratory exposure. So you breathe in toxins from water-damaged buildings. These fungus, these bacteria, grow in the water-damaged homes, release toxins. People breathe in and start having symptoms. Now, it is a very under-recognized, underdiagnosed dysregulation. It's part of the innate immune system, so it's hereditary, so a certain subset of the population is susceptible to this, something like 25% actually, and so it's a silent epidemic. Now, this doesn't mean that 25% of people suffer from chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but 25% are susceptible, so that if they were exposed to this environmental stressor, they would probably develop it. Now, there is a treatment, and the treatment right now that is showing clinical efficacy is the Shoemaker protocol. And then finally, another big highlight is chronic fatigue syndrome is probably a mixed diagnosis for CIRS. Another name for that is myalgic encephalomyelitis, and so there's probably an overlap there. A really helpful table from this review is the summary of literature on treatments. And as you might notice, almost all of these studies, the name that keeps popping up is Shoemaker, along with others, but Shoemaker is certainly the key here. So it's probably important to look at who Shoemaker is and how he came to study CIRS. So let's go back to the origin. Dr. Richie Shoemaker, a medical doctor and researcher, in 1997 published a paper, Diagnosis of Pfeifferia Human Illness Syndrome. So Pfeifferia is a toxin-forming dinoflagellate, and it's found in places like estuaries. It's responsible for killing fish, but it turns out that it's also linked to human disorders. And so he found that there's these human illnesses. He called it P. fastiera human illness syndrome. Later, he followed up with another paper more broadly in 2001 about estuary-associated syndrome. He called it estuary-associated syndrome, and found a lot of the patients from both of these things would have exposure to something in the estuary, whether it's P. fastiera, etc. They'd have memory losses, cognitive issues, pain, headaches, even like abdominal pain, and so a lot of bad outcomes, chronic outcomes. And from there, the first paper I could find that he actually jumped from just more specific estuary, water exposure to water damaged homes was this paper in 2003, Sick Building Syndrome in Water Damaged Buildings, Generalization of the Chronic Biotoxin Associated Illness Paradigm to Indoor Toxigenic Fungi. So another term he had started using was chronic biotoxin associated illness. And now that you could say that that would be synonymous with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So he had a hypothesis that sick building syndrome is a chronic biotoxin associated illness caused predominantly by the exposure to water damaged buildings. And what he found in this paper, the results, that this syndrome involved a multiple systems, especially a neurological functional deficit, and there are biochemical abnormalities. And in a particular test that was helpful was this visual testing visual contrast sensitivity. It was a useful biomarker, or not marker, test marker for neurotoxicity. So if people had visual contrast sensitivity, often was a strong signal for having CIRS. So in this paper, useful case definition. First of all, you need to have potential exposure to toxigenic fungi in water damaged homes, have different symptoms, and then there's more specific criteria that involved biomarkers, etc. They also had to have positive response to the treatment to really have a case definition. So moving on from there, Dr. Shoemaker and others did more research. One of the most in-depth resources on this is a report they put together. Dr. Schumacher, Dr. Mark, Dr. McMahon, and others put together in 2010 this research committee report for diagnosis and treatment of CIRS caused by exposure to water damaged buildings. And it's 161 pages going over some of the science background, agency opinions, the effects of animal health, human health, sort of responding to committees or organizations that are skeptical of CIRS, primary epidemiology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it really goes through in depth, lots of studies, a lot of resources here. Also talking about treatment protocols. They go over the Shoemaker protocol. Dr. Mark and Dr. McMahon also have protocols. They're pretty similar. I think the Schumacher protocol becomes sort of the default as it moves forward. And buried within all of this, I have a really just a phenomenal quote, sort of especially responding to critics who had fairly hollow critiques. On page 93, there's this phrase: simple possession of an advanced degree, such as an MD or PhD, does not imbue the possessor with enhanced insight into the issue of human health effects acquired following exposure to the interior environment of water-damaged buildings. So that's just sort of a brutal takedown to a unreflective credentialism. So that's a great gem of this report. All right, so we have this issue, CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's predominantly set off by water damaged buildings, the microbes in there having toxins. So how do you diagnose this more formally? Well, there's this steps of the Shoemaker protocol for treating this that goes through a variety of this. So it's a very helpful resource. So one of the figures it has is these different biotoxin illness symptom clusters. You can see there's a lot of symptoms that can result from CIRS, anywhere from fatigue to more mental neurotoxic effects to physical effects like shortness of breath, even an abdominal pain, difficulty sleeping, light sensitivity, even things like metallic taste in your mouth. So a lot of different disease clusters. Now with case criteria, a little more clear one than in the earlier paper. They need to have symptoms consistent with biotoxin illness. So in the previous image, if you have 6 of them, that's grounds for going through a more thorough workup. If you have 8 system clusters, it's really consistent with that biotoxin illness with CIRS. And then, of course, you have to have exposure, a history of exposure, whether it's water-damaged homes would be the primary one, but also harkening back to Schumacher's early work, things like toxigenic algae, or even things like tick bites or consumption of toxic reef fish. Again, coming back into the picture, this visual contrast sensitivity, that's a test that really helps solidify. It's a very strong marker of it, as well as other diagnoses like genetic predisposition, presence of these markons. These are going to be these bacteria, other biomarkers, and measurements. In this protocol, there's also a detailed biotoxin pathway if you really want to get into how things work, what's actually going on sort of at the granular level. So you can reference this if you're really interested in kind of digging into actually how these pathways and illnesses get into it. But I'll leave that for you. Let's get into a little more practical, the treatment, because really the big thing behind CIRS is, well, how you actually treat CIRS. So in the Shoemaker protocol, there's a treatment steps. It's a pyramid and then goes into more details. Starting at the base is the remove exposure. Source of this inflammagen exposure, these toxigenic fungi mostly, but then there's also bacteria and then of course other minor sources that aren't water damaged homes. Then you need to reduce biotoxin load. That's like the CSM or Welchol. CSM is, I think, chlorocytyramine, and so it reduces the circulating biotoxin burden. From there, you can start doing things like eliminate, again, markons. Markons is multiple antibiotic resistant coagulase negative staphylococcus. So it's a bacteria that's often formed biofilms, can be deeply in nasal cavities. You need to use some sort of spray like beg spray, Bactroban, adidiatate, disodium, gentamicin spray. And you need to start correcting things more at the hormonal and the biomarker, the protein level. Before that, you want to avoid gluten, so that helps correct anti-gliadin, so elevated serum anti-gliadin antibodies, and so because gluten can cause inflammation, could keep further inflammation, and already, because that's a big thing, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, there's a lot of inflammation, so it's sort of out of control. And you want to restore androgen balance, especially adrenal and gonadal androgen and endocrines. You want to restore osmolality, so that's blood when it's too concentrated or thick. You need to deal with that. Decrease MMP9, which is matrix metalloproteinase 9. So you want to decrease those levels that are associated with inflammation. You want to increase VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, which will improve oxygen delivery to the cells. You want to decrease C3A and C4A, which will improve oxygen delivery again and decrease inflammation. You want to correct by decreasing TGF-beta1 or transforming growth factor beta. That will help restore immune regulation and balance. And then finally, correct low VIP, so increase VIP, which is vascular active intestinal polypeptide, and that'll help restore neural regulation to reestablish normal systems. And so kind of you build up all these treatment steps and it's shown clinical efficacy. So with that, where do we go? CIRS, it seems really under diagnosis, silent epidemic. What more can be done in the field? Well, first of all, I think it's pretty clear that there should be increased awareness and uses of the Shoemaker protocol to actually treat people who may have this and not know. And then it might be useful for treating other chronic illnesses. We saw that water damaged homes was a big component, but there's other components like tick bites and reef fish, estuaries. And there's a paper, the 2024 review talked about using this protocol for other syndromes like long COVID, mRNA vaccine-related injuries, autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders, etc. So I think that would be helpful to see, like, well, can a shoemaker protocol or a shoemaker-like protocol be used for other chronic illnesses? Finally, I think studying the interaction of other indoor air issues, like, for example, from the EPA's indoor pollutants and sources. We already see things like mold and moisture on there, main source of CIRS, maybe biological contaminants, but it'd be interesting to see, well, how does that affect the indoor microbiome? How does something like radon interact with CIRS? How does something like volatile organic compounds interact with CIRS? That'd be interesting, I think, to look at. So with that, here's references that I looked at today. Definitely look into it yourself. The review at the top is probably a great place to start, and you can go from there. If you really want to go whole hog, definitely the Research Committee report. With that, hopefully you enjoyed this. What was the most surprising thing you heard about CIRS? You can leave that in the comments. Also, what scientific topics should I cover next? I try to cover interesting topics to help spur ideas, spur research. So leave that in the comment as well. And please, like and subscribe if you found this useful. I'm working to bring more higher quality scientific videos to this channel, so your support helps. With that, I'm supported by Transcend, so thank you so much.